Just when you thought it was safe to go back online, SMSL released another DAC and amp, and it started the hype train all over again. If you recall, SMSL started selling the SU-6 and the SH-6 only recently. This is the newest entry-level setup from this company. The SU-6 costs $170, while the SH-6 costs $120. Shenzhen Audio sent me both products to review. Shenzhen Audio is an online retailer that specializes in hi-fi gear. They've got some exotic stuff mixed in with the usual. From DACs to amps to IEMs to DAPs, Shenzhen Audio has an impressive lineup. These guys have competitive prices and good customer service. If you're in the market to buy, take a look at Shenzhen Audio. So, what about the newest DAC and amp on the block? What is everybody so excited over? SMSL says that the SU-6 is high-res certified. Let us immediately dispense with that nonsense. High-res stickers are irrelevant and do not remotely signify an objective standard of audio quality. But every company wants to let you know they've got the little badge. The SU-6 has a single ES9038Q2M DAC and 4 op-amps. You'll get full PCM support and up to DSD-512. The SU-6 has Bluetooth 5.0 and caters to the whole spectrum of Bluetooth codecs, including LDAC. However, this is Bluetooth reception only. You don't get transmission. Their marketing says that the SU-6 uses, quote, a large number of audio-grade components, end quote. That is a strange statement. I have no idea what that means, other than that it's marketing mumbo-jumbo to convince you that somehow the components were hand-selected for audio quality. I will leave that for you to discuss among yourselves, but I don't really buy it. SMSL has a frequency response measurement for the SU-6. It shows a perfectly flat graph. You'll get the standard 2 VRMS through the RCA output. SMSL says that the SH-6 has low distortion feedback circuitry, exceedingly low THD, which you can't hear, and, quote, incredible power output. The SH-6 allegedly has 2.6 watts into 16 ohms, oh boy, that's a big number, and 1.3 watts into 32 ohms. Don't worry, we will definitely talk about this claim later. The SH-6 has a no-pop feature. Essentially, with some amps, you might hear a pop when you have your headphones plugged in and turn the amp on or off. The $500 RNHP has this issue, and the folks at Rupert Neve say this is due to the capacitors discharging in their amp. Frankly, I can validate SMSL's claims about this. There is no popping sound. The SU-6 and the SH-6 are tiny. They're almost palm-sized. They're light, yet sturdy. SMSL says these are machined aluminum, and they sure feel like it. You can press hard on the top, bottom sides, and the chassis won't give. The SU-6 has an LCD screen on the front. This will provide information about the data stream, though only the sample rate. A capacitive touch button on the side will let you select among the various inputs. This includes USB, coaxial, Bluetooth, and optical. The SU-6 has only an RCA out with 2 volts. SMSL seems pretty happy with their new remote that comes with the SU-6. It's plastic, but again, sturdy. I'm not sure why this is supposed to be impressive since it has limited functionality. You can control the backlight through the remote, which lets you keep the screen on at all times or have a preset timer to turn it off. You can also select among several brightness settings. The remote lets you mute and control volume. You can select input. Finally, the remote lets you choose among the various typical DAC filters. One thing that I kept encountering was that when I used the remote to change the LCD brightness, there was a cutting in and out of the music when I was playing music through the DAC. This was a strange feature. I have never experienced this with any other DAC that has the ability to dim the LEDs or the LCD screens. In this instance, with the SU-6, every time I tried to change from one brightness level to another brightness level, there was an immediate cutoff of the music and then immediately restarting of the music from where it had left off. This was strange, and I can't explain it. The SH-6 has a couple of toggle switches on the front. The first is a selector among off, headphone out, or pre-out. I like this toggle because you can leave the main power button on the back active, yet still turn the amp off from the front. The second switch is the low and high gain selector. The high gain ostensibly adds 15.5 decibels. That jump is easily perceptible. Finally, the SH-6 has a small volume knob, which surprisingly is plastic, and it feels a little bit cheap. The amp has RCA in and out on the back. I encountered a funny problem with the SH-6 and its power cable. Here's the thing. Both the SH-6 and the SU-6 use NEMA C7 cables. The SU-6 came with one, but the SH-6 came with a NEMA C12 cable, which is not remotely the correct one. I don't know how the packaging department at the factory messed that up. Luckily, I have a few C7 cables from my Leica camera chargers, so I cannibalized one for this review. However, I can imagine that if a typical customer ran into this problem, they'd be a little upset. Overall, these products have, for the most part, good build. You get the features you need without the frills. The plastic volume knob on the SH-6 is, frankly, in my opinion, disappointing, especially since SMSL's marketing spends a lot of time lauding the CNC machine chassis. The fact that my unit came with the wrong cable was comical, but that comedy could easily have been frustration for somebody else. Let's talk performance. With these DAC and amp reviews, I don't waste time about how an amp makes me feel. I don't care because you don't care, and you shouldn't care. All you care about is whether these are products you may want to spend money on. So you won't hear me talk about dynamics, synergy, liveliness, or any other audiophile jargon. What you will hear and see is my findings through direct A and B comparisons. If I hear any differences among products, I'll tell you. If I don't, I'll definitely tell you. I recently uploaded a video about how you can assemble your own AB DAC testing rig for under $25. It's the same setup I have. If you're serious about examining these products, you really should do your own comparisons. You need to put claims under hard scrutiny because, after all, it is your money we're talking about. Let's discuss my testing methodology here. I first tested the SU-6 and SH-6 together as a stack. I wanted to know if, as a combo unit, they exhibited any immediate issues such as audible distortion, channel imbalance, or any difficulty in use. I next tested the SU-6 against competitor DACs. This included the SMSL Sanskrit Mark II with the AKM4493 DAC chip. I also compared against the Songcos LAQX-D1, which has the same DAC as the SU-6. And finally, I tested against the SMSL SU-9N, which has the ESS 9038 Pro chip. I connected each of these DACs to the same PC. I used Voicemeeter Banana to send audio signal to the SU-6 and the competitor DACs at the same time in a head-to-head setup. I connected each DAC to a passive RCA switch, and that switch was connected to various amplifiers. And because someone invariably will complain about using a passive switch box, I used two different switch boxes from different companies, just to mix things up. Of course, I listened with the SH-6 as one of the testing amps for these DAC tests. The final comparison I did was with the SH-6 against a few alternative amplifiers. I pitted the SH-6 against the Shit Heresy and the RNHP. I made sure to volume match the DACs and the amplifiers. I used various headphones including the Sennheiser HD660S, the audeze LCD2 Classic, and the hifi Mansandara. Throughout my time with the SH-6, I deployed a litany of other headphones from my collection, but for purposes of this specific test, I relied on these three. I used the same headphones for the amplifier tests. I listened to my test playlist on both Amazon Music HD and Qobuz. The fundamental question for the DAC and AM test was rather simple. Do I hear any difference whatsoever among the gear? Is the Sanskrit different from the SU-6? Does the SU-9N have different performance from the SU-6? And, of course, we have the same types of questions in relation to the SH-6. Now that you have a clear idea of my testing methods, let's get right into the results. First and foremost, the SU-6 and SH-6 stack works perfectly. There's no hassle. It's a connect and go operation. This is as simple a setup as you can imagine with a stack. You'll need an RCA cable and maybe the correct power cable, no thanks to SMSL. I could not hear any distortion with this setup. The SH-6 did not exhibit channel imbalance. I didn't need to download drivers for the SU-6, but if there are new drivers available from SMSL, you may want to check those out. Of course, Macs don't need audio drivers, so if you've got an Apple computer, that's not even an option for you. I played with the various DAC PCM filters on the SU-6. The manual tells you the different types, but of course does not explain what we should listen for. Regardless, I couldn't hear any differences. That's par for the course where DAC filters are concerned. I should point out that if you've got a sensitive IEM, for example one with an impedance of under 16 ohms, you might hear some hiss in the signal. I heard a faint sound with the Campfire Audio Andromeda, but that wasn't really an issue when music was playing since it wasn't apparent at that point. Let's move on to the DAC comparisons. I first compared the SU-6 against the Sanskrit. Initially, I thought there was an immediate difference. Going back and forth, it sounded like there was a huge difference in clarity on the SU-6. As we know from experience, just because we hear a difference doesn't mean a DAC is actually superior. There might be an issue with the connection or some other factor we have to eliminate. The connections, it turned out, were fine, and I reseated the cables just in case. I also tried again after switching cables. Next, I checked the DAC volume outputs. Both were at max, but it just seemed that the SU-6 was clearer. I kept switching back and forth and thought that perhaps there's a slight voltage difference. So, I decided to reduce the volume on the SU-6. I decreased its volume by 5 steps. Bingo! That did the trick. When properly volume matched, there was no immediate difference between the two DACs. Going back and forth with this matched output, I could not hear a single deviation. The clarity I thought I heard before now had melted away. It appears to have been nothing more than volume matching at issue because of varying voltages. When comparing the SON cost to the SU-6, there was no difference whatsoever. I couldn't hear any alterations in bass, mids, or treble. There wasn't an ounce of difference with clarity, separation, or any other musical factor. They performed in an identical manner. And I didn't have to volume match these because they seemed to be outputting the same amount of voltage. Finally, I tried the SU-9N. This time, the 9N was slightly louder. I adjusted its volume down 3 steps. That got the two DACs matched. There were no differences, yet again, between them. Every genre I tried, whether it be pop, rock, hip-hop, classical, orchestral, or spoken word, there was not the slightest obvious difference. I would have been happy to hear subtle differences, but there weren't any. Let's talk about the amp test next. Remember, I compared the SH-6 against the Heresy and the RNHP. I used the SU-6 as the test DAC. I used the RCA switch box to send signal to both amps at the same time. The Heresy and SH-6 have selectable high gain, and I did test them in both low and high gain settings. I repeated the test using a simple RCA splitter and taking out one of the switch boxes in the chain. Going back and forth between the Heresy and the SH-6, there was no audible difference whatsoever. The music always sounded exactly the same in tonality. I had the same result when I switched to the RNHP. None of these amps was more silent than the other. Sitting with my headphones, no music playing, I couldn't hear any distortion or hiss or any other hallmarks of difference. Now, some people want me to tell them the sound signature of an amplifier. I can't do that if the product has a neutral or transparent amplification. I'm not sure what else I can say other than there's no appreciable differences among these amps. Overall, the SU-6 is a neutral DAC and the SH-6 is a neutral amp. There's not much more to say than that, and there's nothing really magical about them. SMSL claims that the SH-6 has 2.6 watts and 1.3 watts of power output. Why would anybody need 2.6 watts into 16 ohms? You know, this is a huge issue among audio products. If an IEM or headphone is 16 ohms, it is already ultra sensitive. The drivers were designed to perform with very little power from an amp, or designed not to need an amp at all. There are exceptions, such as with the audeze LCD1, but that's the nature of planar drivers. But 2.6 watts? I was scratching my head trying to figure out on what plane of reality such power output would be necessary. And then I took another look at SMSL's charts. Things fell into place. Of course, as with all SMSL and topping measurements, we need to be very careful. I might as well point this out now. The incredible power output that SMSL is referring to evidently was achieved by connecting the amp to a 5-volt DAC. There are some strange numbers with the SH-6. Let's take a look. First, I think it's really odd for a company, any company, to claim power output numbers but not clearly state how they achieved that particular measurement. I've scanned through the SMSL documentation and I cannot find any mention of the DAC that they actually used for those measurements. A DAC's output voltage will affect the power output of a connected amp. What I did find, however, were THD graphs that clearly showed a 5-volt connection. I have to assume that the same DAC was used when measuring for power output. I'm guessing because SMSL doesn't tell us. The next odd number is the output impedance. SMSL says it's near 0 ohms. Usually we expect a particular number even if it is in the tenths position. Near 0 could mean above 0 or below 0. It could be 0.1 ohms or 2.0 ohms. Whether this will have any material effect on your headphones is a separate issue, but I just figure you should know. Then there's that little specification about the SU-6's frequency response. They claim 20 Hz to 500,000 Hz. I noticed this about SMSL's other headphone amps, but I let it go. I just couldn't help mentioning it this time, however. It's just such an odd specification to use since it literally cannot be heard. Look, I understand if some of this stuff you find irrelevant. I don't. I think it's just yet more nonsense we have to wade through. Unfortunately, I could not find a third-party measurement of the SH-6. ASR did measure the SU-6 and confirmed it to be a 2-volt RCA output. But either SMSL did not send ASR the SH-6 or ASR has not posted those measurements yet. I bring all of this up because it's vitally important for us to recognize when we're being distracted with padded measurements. Over the last several years, a number of SMSL and topping fans have challenged me to disprove these types of measurements, as if the claim a manufacturer makes is automatically truthful. We know historically that these companies provide misleading measurements. We have repeatedly found through ASR and other forums a notable discrepancy at least with amplifier power output. It's not up to us to disprove SMSL or topping, it's up to these companies to prove their claims. They have to provide clear information about their measurement methodology. Yet, despite releasing product after product after product, they still have not done that. The point I'm trying to make is that we simply cannot accept the SH-6 power output as true. We have no reason to. And what scant information is available from SMSL seems to strongly suggest that the 2.6 watts and 1.3 watts were obtained once connected to a significantly higher voltage DAC than, say, the SU-6. I don't know of any single-ended DAC that has 5-volt output. SMSL might be able to push that much voltage using a measurement rig in their labs, but us mere mortals do not have that capability. Real-world tests show that the SH-6 has plenty of power for most typical headphones. You don't need 2.6 watts into any IEM or headphone that I know of. I never struggled to drive the LCD2, Avantone Planar, any of my dynamic drivers, or even the 600 ohm Beyerdynamic T1. When I compared back and forth between the SH-6 and the Heresy and volume matched them, the headphones didn't perform any differently. The Heresy, I should point out, appears to achieve its high power output through a 2-volt connection, at least when you review ASR's measurements and compare them to Schitt's own claims. ASR measured the Heresy generally about 100 milliwatts short of what Schitt says we should get, but at least we're somewhere near the ballpark. When we turn to more demanding headphones, like the Modhouse Argon, things are a little different. The Argon needs about 1 watt at 50 ohms. That's the nature of the Fostex drivers. When the Argon have substantially less power, you can tell. The bass is a little bit muddier, there's less separation in sub-bass from mid-bass, and mid-bass impact is not as sharp. There's also less clarity in the midsection. Overall clarity slightly is reduced when the headphones are underpowered. When I tested between the Heresy and the SH-6, I noticed the indicators of underpowered performance when listening to the SH-6. Was it a night and day difference? No, not really. It's not as if the Argon was distorted or unlistenable, but in an A/B test the difference were there. This brings me back to the whole measurement thing. If people have a demanding headphone like the Argon and want an amp to drive it, they might be enticed based on measurements alone to purchase the SH-6. But if the SH-6 has lower power output than what SMSL claims, then those select individuals will have been misled into buying a product that doesn't do what they were told. That is the problem. At this juncture, I have no idea what SMSL did to get the power output measurements for the SH-6. They aren't clear about it, and it's not my job to disprove their numbers. It's their job to establish how they achieved their measurements. The bottom line is that for most applications, the SH-6 is plenty powerful, especially if you're using IEMs and dynamic driver headphones. But if you expect this amp to provide 2.6 watts, I think you will need to do some more research. You'll meet two camps of audiophiles. One side will say that SMSL and Topping make amazing products that push the boundaries of technicalities. The other side will say that these companies use cheap components and shoddy measurements to bedazzle the public. I have owned several amps and DACs from both companies. My Sanskrit, for example, is 3 years old, has been tossed around, shoved between a wall and a bookcase, loaned to various people who have been less than gentle with it, and this DAC continues to work great. It's a perfectly good DAC and does exactly what a DAC needs to do. I've never had a Topping or SMSL product fail on me, but I know there are complaints online where people have run into build issues. The fundamental problem with SMSL and Topping is their lack of differentiation in the market, a market that they increasingly control. By dumping product after product into the mainstream, these companies guarantee that their names will constantly be uttered. Here, with the SU-6 and the SH-6, SMSL wants to capture the lower-tiered category. This is a space that is generally occupied by the likes of shit, at least in the US. Does SMSL do enough to justify the price tags? This brings us to value. The answer is yes and no. The SU-6 at nearly $170 is, I think, a fairly expensive product for what it does. It's got a neutral DAC, single-ended output, and various input options. But beyond these connections, you don't really get much more. The DAC filters are as questionable as ever. The small form factor is of some significance, as is the build, but I'm not sure either makes up for the limited feature set. The question for a potential buyer is this: what exactly are you looking to accomplish? Forget all that nonsense about these DACs sounding more dynamic or lively or boring. These are neutral, transparent DACs. Their sound signatures are not relevant. Instead, what do you want the DAC to do? That is the real question. If you need a simple single-ended connection and no frills, then I think the SU-6 is overpriced. If you won't use Bluetooth, have no need for optical or coaxial connection, then what reason would compel you to spend $170 for a DAC that does what the $100 Topping D10S does? It all comes down to features at the end of the day. If we compare the SU-6 to the Sanskrit and the Modi, you'll notice that the price differences among these three products is between $30 and $40. In that event, ask yourself if Bluetooth, a digital display, and a remote justify buying the SU-6 over the Modi or the Sanskrit. So, yes, while a bit expensive, the SU-6 can be value. It just depends on what you're looking for. Turning to the SH-6, this is a hard one for me. The SH-6 costs $120. It's built well, except for that plastic volume knob, and I never really had an issue with it. On paper and in real-world use, it's a perfectly good amp. But what makes this value judgment more difficult for me is the odd measurement numbers from SMSL. I am very hesitant to recommend a product whose marketing promises specific performance if we don't actually get that promised performance. If it turns out that SMSL skewed the power output for the SH-6 by using a 5-volt DAC, I have a hard time endorsing a product whose marketing is so nefariously used. If we assume for the sake of argument that SMSL did use a 5-volt DAC, and that's how they measured 2.6 and 1.3 watts, I don't think I can endorse, recommend, or laud the SH-6. I'm sorry, it's just not worth it. I cannot get behind a product, no matter how well it might perform, if the marketing claims power output that you and I will never see. On the other hand, if it turns out that SMSL's power output measurements were with a 2-volt DAC, then we have a different story. Then we are not dealing with false marketing. In that event, I don't have a problem saying that this product is value. I have no issues recommending it. Just imagine if only SMSL and Topping would provide specific data about how they achieved their power output results, we wouldn't have this confusion. And that's my conundrum. While other reviews of this product simply regurgitate the marketing, I'm asking you to be very mindful and careful of it. So, while I think the SU-6 is arguably value, I'm holding judgment of the SH-6 until we get some straight answers about it.